All right, let's talk about a moment in history that honestly could have been our last. We're diving into a single standoff that brought the entire planet to the very edge of total annihilation. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Everything came down to this one number, 13. For 13 absolutely agonizing days back in October of 1962, the fate of, and I mean this literally, every single person on Earth was just hanging by a thread.
And you really have to let this sink in. This wasn't some Hollywood blockbuster. This was real life. It was a terrifyingly real countdown to a global catastrophe, with the world's two biggest superpowers staring each other down.
So you might be asking, how on earth did we get here? Well, this crisis didn't just pop up out of nowhere. No, it was the climax of years and years of escalating Cold War tension, basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
So let's trace the steps, right? It really kicks off in 1959 when Fidel Castro takes power in Cuba. Then, in 1961, you have the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. The U.S. tried to oust Castro, but it failed, badly. And all it did was push him straight into an alliance with the Soviet Union. And just like that, the Cold War wasn't thousands of miles away anymore. It was, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
At the center of all this, you've got two leaders under incredible pressure. On the American side, President Kennedy absolutely could not afford to look soft on communism. He'd had some setbacks. Meanwhile, the Soviet premier, Khrushchev, he saw a golden opportunity. He could protect his new communist buddy in Cuba, get some leverage over the situation in Berlin, and, maybe most importantly, completely change the nuclear balance of power. You can see how both guys were kind of trapped by politics and pride. In that calculation, that strategic chess move by Khrushchev led to a discovery that sent shockwaves across the globe and kicked off what is probably the most dangerous confrontation in all of human history.
This is the moment where everything changes. U.S. spy planes flying high over Cuba came back with photographs that were just undeniable. The Soviets were building nuclear missile sites. The abstract threat of nuclear war suddenly became very, very real, with a launch pad aimed right at America's doorstep.
And that discovery is what starts the clock ticking on those 13 days. A period of intense, top-secret debate where every single choice, every word, could be the one that accidentally tipped the entire world into nuclear war.
I mean, can you just imagine being in that room? For almost 2 weeks straight, Kennedy and his top advisors, this group they called XCOM, were basically locked away having these grueling, high-stakes arguments about what to do. Their options range from quiet diplomacy all the way to a full-blown military invasion. And really, this was the question, the central dilemma. Do you launch a surprise airstrike to take out the missiles? But if you do that, you're almost guaranteeing a massive immediate retaliation from the Soviets. Or do you try something less aggressive? I mean, seriously, put yourself in their shoes. What would you have done? In the end, Kennedy went for middle path. He announced a naval quarantine around Cuba. Now, let's be clear, it was a blockade, but they called it a quarantine because a blockade is technically an act of war. The goal was pretty simple. Stop any more Soviet ships with military supplies from getting to the island and buy everyone some time to think. It was a strong move for sure, but it wasn't the final one. And as tensions got higher and higher, Khrushchev sent this really powerful message to Kennedy. It's a fascinating look into his mindset. He used this metaphor of two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle over a bottomless pit. It shows that even the leaders themselves knew just how close they were to mutual disaster. They were both in it together.
And Kennedy, when he went on TV to tell the American people what was happening, he struck a similar tone. Very firm, but also very cautious. He didn't hide the danger, but he framed the quarantine as the right thing to do, a principled stand. And after that speech, the entire world just held its breath, watching as Soviet ships sailed right towards that American quarantine line.
So how did this all end without, nuclear winter? Well, while everyone was focused on the ships at sea, the real solution was being worked out behind the scenes. And let me tell you, what the public was told, well, that was only about half the story.
Okay, so let's break this down because this part is key. The public deal was pretty straightforward. The Soviets pull their missiles out of Cuba, and in return, the U.S. promises to never invade Cuba. Simple enough. But here's the secret part. The U.S. also agreed to quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were pointed right at the Soviet Union. This secret part of the deal was absolutely vital. It gave Khrushchev a way to save face so he could go back home and frame this whole thing as a victory, not a humiliating retreat.
So the immediate crisis was over. Everyone could breathe again. But the fallout from those 13 days would completely reshape the Cold War. It created this new, terrifying kind of stability.
For the three main leaders, the results were deeply personal. Kennedy came out of it looking like a strong, brilliant statesman. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was seen by many in his own government as the one who blinked, and this perception ultimately led to him being kicked out of power a couple of years later. And what about Fidel Castro? Well, he was furious. He felt like he'd just been used as a pawn in a superpower chess game.
But you know, some good actually came from staring into that abyss. Both Washington and Moscow were so profoundly shaken by how close they'd come to the end of the world that they started taking real steps to make sure it never happened again. They set up the famous hotline, a direct line of communication between the White House and the Kremlin. And this whole crisis actually paved the way for the first major arms control agreements, like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And all of this led to a new, horrifying strategic reality that would define the rest of the Cold War. It has a fitting acronym: MAD, for Mutually Assured Destruction. The logic was as simple as it was terrifying. If I know that you can completely destroy me, and you know that I can completely destroy you, then neither of us is ever crazy enough to push the button first. And that right there became the ultimate takeaway from those 13 days. For both the United States and the Soviet Union, the crisis hammered home one simple fact: a nuclear war could not be won. The only winning move was not to play the game at all.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. There's no doubt the Cuban Missile Crisis pulled us back from the brink. But in doing so, it created this balance of fear that hung over the world for decades. So, did those 13 days truly save us, or did they just teach us how to live with a nuclear sword hanging permanently over all of our heads?